see a couple people popping in right now. Can you hear me okay? Just do a like or make a comment if you feel like the sound is working for you. Can you hear me? We're going to start here in a couple of minutes. All right, thanks, Josh. Before we have people hop on and get started officially, I just want to offer some thoughts on resources before we officially kind of start the lecture, just as it's still before 1 o'clock and people are trying to log on. I do, in the name of some self-promotion here, want to recommend you take a peek at my book, Beginner's Guide to New Testament Studies. It offers a number of chapters on different debated issues in the New Testament, including women in the Bible and women's leadership according to the Bible. And so if you haven't looked at it, you might be interested. There's a chapter that covers kind of both sides or a spectrum of views on the issue, which will be more even-handed. There's actually a good couple of bibliographies in there to get you started on reading more detailed information than what we can offer in this lecture. As we're still getting started, I just want to recommend a couple of commentaries to you if you want to go deeper, you want to dig further in some of the things I'm saying. I'm sure some of the things I'm saying will be more advanced or require some more detailed examination. So I just want to recommend a couple of commentaries, and I'll recommend some other things in the course of the lecture. One is I. Howard Marshall's ICC commentary on the Pastoral Epistles. Marshall is a now passed, but he's a seasoned commentary writer and written numerous eminent commentaries. So he really knows how to do this well. He looks at every detail. So this is a really important volume to have. I have it on Logos, so I end up using my Logos version. Howard Marshall, I. Howard Marshall, I.H. Marshall. And it's quite thick. It's going to give a lot of detail. I would say probably best if you know Greek if you're going to work with this, because he gets in the nitty-gritty. I found it overall very competent and one of the better commentaries in terms of really level-headed verse-by-verse analysis. A more recent commentary that I've been reading, I'm actually reviewing this for a journal, is by Christopher Hudson in the Paideia series, 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. Hudson really has strength in classics and ancient history. So it's not as much a theological commentary as it's going to help you contextualize the pastoral epistles, 1 Timothy, 2 Timothy, and Titus, into the ancient world, into the world of ancient Ephesus. He knows a lot about the Greco-Roman world, so he's going to give you all kinds of on-the-ground information about how a regular reader of the text at that time would have taken some of the language Paul uses and things like that. So I'm actually about halfway through this, and I'm really finding it very beneficial. He doesn't really dig much into theological issues. So don't go there expecting that, but if you want a really good, contextualized, competent study, that's the place to look. Someone asked, Eric asked, I am writing a Pastoral Epistles commentary for the series. It's called Reading the New Testament with Helwys. The publisher is Helwys. Reading the New Testament. It's actually a newer, it's an old series that's being redone. And only a couple of New Testament commentaries have appeared in that series, which is why you may not have heard of it. But I'm working on it now. It'll take me a few years because I really want to do a good job and get into the details. So, okay, well, we'll do an official welcome since it's after 1 o'clock. So welcome. These are my Facebook Live lectures. I did one last month. You can go to my blog, Crux Sola. Just type my name into a search engine. There aren't a whole lot of Nijay Guptas that do New Testament studies. So you can go there and look for it. It occurred about a month ago, so you can look for it there. And this is another one, and a text that often people will ask me about is 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 11 to 15. So if you have your Bible, go ahead and grab it so you can look at what we're talking about. Maybe you're not as familiar with this debate and discussion, so go ahead and have your Bibles open if you have one nearby. And to be honest, I've been, for years and years, I've been kind of intimidated because, it is kind of considered kind of linchpin text for a view that women should not be church leaders. And I thought, with the writing this commentary, and I'm working on a book on women leaders of the earliest Christian churches for InterVarsity Press, academic, I thought it was time that I really dig into this. So I spent the last about a year reading as much as I possibly can. So I've read a lot more, and I've written 30 plus pages of notes that I can't get into in detail, but I'll do what I can do best in 40 minutes, and then we'll have time for Q&A. But just to give kind of an anecdotal background, when I moved to England to do my PhD, I reached out to a church, local church there, and because we were looking at where we wanted to go to church. My wife is a minister, and so we asked, I sent an email to the pastor. I said, I'm a PhD student at Durham. I'd like to know what your views are on women preachers, because my wife and I would like to do some preaching. And polite gentleman, but he sent an email back saying, basically read 1 Timothy and you'll know where we stand. And I think that was his way of saying, we're a biblical church, we don't believe women should be preachers, end of story. And this text, again, has that kind of impression that it's an open and shut case. If you don't, those who, and I was actually, someone that did not believe in women as church leaders when I was in early part of seminary, and I would have naturally appealed to this text. And only as a result of doing some serious study, I did some in seminary, I did a lot more recently, did I actually come to a better understanding of this, and probably more importantly, troubled the waters of when people say it's an open and shut or clear case. When people say 1 Timothy 2 obviously says, okay, that's a clue to me that they don't know Greek. Because if they knew Greek, they would know that it's not obvious, and I'll explain that why in a minute. So I have several points here. I want to start out with orienting ourselves to 1 Timothy. Now, one of the things that I've become challenged with, convicted of, is that it's misleading to refer to these three letters as the Pastoral Epistles. I do it all the time, but Paul didn't necessarily write them as a kind of three-part package. In fact, that terminology of pastoral epistles doesn't really come into play until the modern era, sometime probably in the 1700s, with a guy by the last name Bordeaux, or possibly Paul Anton. And even in the medieval church, it probably didn't become kind of a thing to think of these as a package of letters written to help pastors do their work until Aquinas, who referred to it as quasi-pastoralis regula, something of a rule for a pastor. And so that's 13th century. So think then in the 1st, 2nd century, 3rd century, these letters aren't thought of as delivering kind of a textbook for pastoral ministry. Now that's important because 1 Timothy is sometimes treated, especially the text we're going to look at, as a kind of guidelines for all ministry everywhere at all times. And I want to say that there are very important reasons why that is not the case. Luke Timothy Johnson, and he's written a nice Anchor Bible commentary on 1 Timothy, he says that in a lot of the earliest Christian material on how pastors should do their jobs, how ministry leaders should do their jobs, 1 Timothy isn't even really appealed to. For example, the 4th century apostolic constitutions, Johnson said, does not quote from 1 Timothy at all, which is a church order manual, the apostolic constitutions. And, to the contrary, Johnson says that 1 Timothy was actually more utilized to combat heresies in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century. So one thing that I have learned from a lot of 1 Timothy commentaries is, and I'm from my own reading of 1 Timothy, is that this text is not Paul just writing general guidelines or tips for Timothy on how to be a better pastor. What we know from 1 Timothy, and if you sit down and read it beginning to end, it'll be really clear, is that the church in Ephesus, where Timothy was placed by Paul, was dealing with devastating false teaching, and the church was in a sense put in kind of a lockdown, just like we're experiencing lockdown. The church was kind of put in a lockdown. So this is an unusual situation in this church. In fact, some scholars say we don't have another church in the first century from Paul's letters that has worse problems with false teaching than the issues in Ephesus behind 1 Timothy. I just spent time recently going through what I think 1 Timothy is all about as a letter, and Paul really has 4 goals in this letter. Firstly, to encourage Timothy as a leader. Maybe he was shy, apprehensive, dealing with issues on all sides. Think of a younger ministerial leader stepping into a pastorate and feeling kind of attacked from all sides. So he wanted to encourage Timothy. He places him there to reject false teaching. And then chapter 2, which is our focus, promote peace, integrity, unity, and good deeds. So peace and unity is a major emphasis in 1 Timothy. And there's a focus really interesting on the language of kingship, the kingship of God, and the language of oikonomia, which means kind of household economy. And so you could really say key theme is the great king deserves a unified and cooperative kingdom. The great king deserves a unified and cooperative kingdom. Okay, let's talk more about the false teaching. Chapter 1, verse 3, Paul says to Timothy, "Stay in Ephesus so that you may command people not to teach false teachings any longer." This is expressly the purpose that he's there. And we don't see anything quite like this except in 2 Timothy and Titus in Paul's letters, where someone is dispatched to kind of put out the fires of false teaching. Yes, there are a number of letters like Galatians where false teaching is an issue. This seems to be particularly cancerous to the church, and Paul is very serious about clamping down on this false teaching. Other things we can glean from the letter about the false teaching, it's within the church, so people are causing problems within the church. It's dealing with core teaching. Sometimes you hear the language of doctrine, sound doctrine. I don't like using the word doctrine because it can come across modernistically as like a systematic theology textbook. I'd rather say core teachings. So over and over again, Paul talks about core teachings. Didaskalia, didasco, where we got the word didactic. And we're going to come back to that. It seems the false teaching has some connection to Jewish law. That may not be the full scope of it, but has some connection to Jewish law. And chapter 5 gives us a clue that this false teaching was undermining the leadership of the church elders. So that's really important to why Paul says the things he does in chapter 2. So I want to give you a little bit. It's a long letter. I spent like an hour today just going back over it again. It's a long letter, so I'm just going to look at chapter 1 and then chapter 2 to verse 15. So chapter 1, Paul addresses the false teaching, and he tells a story of God's mercy. So I'm guessing the false teaching doesn't emphasize God's mercy. That would be my conclusion. 2, in chapter 1, Paul gives a key command, and this may be kind of the thesis of the letter in terms of Timothy's perspective. Chapter 1, verse 18 to 20, fight the good fight of faith well. Fight the battle well. Which tells us it's a combative letter. It's a very combative letter. Chapter 2, the first part of chapter 2, verses 1 to 7, you could label that promoting peace for all. So that can tell us that this false teaching caused subversion and elitism. And then verses 8 to 10, promoting peace, and then focusing on different gender groups. So men, the correction is move towards unity and calm. Women move towards modesty and good deeds. Now, this isn't saying every single man is, ready to punch somebody. It's not saying every single woman was wearing fancy jewelry, but generally speaking, it's saying these are the issues that men were dealing with, these are the issues women are dealing with. Now, verse 11 to 15, which is going to be our focus, I consider this an expansion of verses 8 to 10. And my label for this, and hopefully by now you understand why I'm labeling it this way, Ephesian women should be humble learners, not prideful teachers. I'll say that again. My kind of outline or headline for this section, verses 11 to 15, chapter 2, Ephesian women should be humble learners, not prideful teachers. Ephesian women should be humble learners, not prideful teachers. Okay, that gives kind of the preliminary background. Someone asked me, make sure you actually go through the letter and don't just kind of, pick and choose. Don't just microscopically focus on one verse of 1 Timothy, but look at it in context. And so, kind of echoing Paul, that was the very thing I was eager to do. So I want to make sure I do that so that you get it. But I'm going to walk through 5 or 6 or 7 points about how I take the verse in context when Paul says, I do not permit a woman to teach or have, authenteo. We're going to talk about what that means. Dominating authority, oppressive authority over a man. We're going to talk about that. Let me say, first off, this is not a clear teaching that lends itself to universal application. First of all, and this is something I think that's often lost in this conversation, Paul knows Timothy very, very well. He's like his right-hand man. And he spent a lot of time with him. He's traveled them to a lot of churches. And he's the one that Paul dispatches when he can't be there himself. For example, with the Thessalonians, Paul had to leave Thessalonica, so he sent Timothy. And Timothy's kind of replacement. Philippians, again, Paul sends Timothy in his place. So Timothy is like another Paul. That's how close they are. In fact, in 1 Thessalonians, he compares him to a son. In 1 Timothy, he actually says, son, my good son, repeatedly through the letter. So the thing that's often missed is Paul says this to Timothy. I do not allow a woman this and that, as if it's new information. Now, had this been Paul's normal teaching, and had Timothy just kind of known this as the rule for all the churches, then he would have said something like, as you well know, we need to make sure that this and this is happening. Paul's very comfortable saying, as you know well, I don't have to inform you. I don't need to remind you. You are not ignorant of the fact that. And yet, he introduces this, not only using unusual vocabulary, which we're going to talk about, but he introduces it as if it's something that Timothy doesn't know, as if it's kind of a new rule or something that Timothy needs kind of convincing of, because of the expansion on the information he gives using Adam and Eve, which we'll talk about later. Another reason why, number one, this is not a clear teaching that lends itself to universal application is we know this church was dealing with rampant false teaching. And because of that false teaching, we know that Paul has a tendency to give more directed information to one church to deal with that situation. So we have to recognize Paul can adapt how he treats churches based on what that church is going through. So for example, to the Corinthians, he says, I'm not going to take your money. I'm not going to take your money. Okay, so he seems to have a policy of not getting entangled in the financial affairs of his churches. But then he says to the Philippians, I really need your money. And so we just can't take it as a baseline assumption he's going to treat every church exactly the same with all the rules. There's one scholar named J. Christian Becker who talks about looking at the contingency and coherence within Paul's letters. So coherence means we can look at Paul and say there are core convictions, beliefs, attitudes, teachings that we can see across his letters on Christology or pneumatology or ecclesiology. But then each letter is going to have its own style and its own teachings that we have to be careful to understand are contingent, related to that situation. So for example, he says in this letter, drink less water, drink more wine. We don't extrapolate that and say that is the best medical advice ever. We understand that's teaching for Timothy. So we're going to look for clues in this text, whether there is universal testimony to wider teaching. But I want to say that because of the rampant nature of the false teaching, we have to be really, really careful not to just assume this is kind of Paul just writing his thoughts on what every church should do. I think that's a really troubling way of thinking about it. Now, what I think is probably the most important thing to come away with from this text and our interpretation of it is there is a key word in this text that we basically don't know what it means. Okay? And the word is authenteo. So let's say you wrote out in English the word authentic. A-U-T-H-E-N-T. And instead of putting IC on it, you put EO. Authenteo. Like authentic, but you end it with EO. Authenteo is a verb that Paul uses, this is my second point, in this text that we sometimes translate have authority. But here's my second point. The verb authenteo is so rare as to be nearly impossible to discern its exact meaning. It's so rare as to be nearly impossible to determine its exact meaning. So when people say, oh, 1 Timothy so clearly teaches, okay, that's because an English translator has to translate it in some way. And then that translation is clear to you, but the Greek behind it, the translators aren't able to convey just how confusing this term is, or how difficult it is to get to its exact meaning. So when we think about how we understand what ancient texts say when they're using a dead language, we rely on use elsewhere. We rely on context. We rely on the more uses, the better. Right? The more uses of a word in antiquity, the better we can ascertain its exact meaning, and we can slice it in many ways. So for most words, you have hundreds or thousands of uses that are extant, meaning still exist, that we can look up in Thucydides or Herodotus or Plutarch or a variety of this vast resource, Josephus, Philo. And for very common words, we'll have thousands, tens of thousands of occurrences. For a more rare word, we may have dozens. In this case, probably within the New Testament, there's only one or two words that will beat it for least attested. So I did a study of the Lord's Prayer. There's a word in there, daily, that we translate daily, and the word is epiousios. And we basically have no idea what it means because it's such a rare word. And we have the situation here with authenteo. In fact, we're not even sure how many texts there are that actually represent the usage of this verb. Scholars will argue somewhere between, let's say, 7 and 15. On the lower end, 6 or 7. On the higher end, maybe more. The reason why it's a bit confusing is because we don't know whether the verb form and the noun form are directly related, or we can separate them so that we can look at the verb by itself. But in any case, let's, I've looked at some of these occurrences in really rare, obscure texts like Philodemus's Rhetorica, or the letter, the papyrus, documentary letter BGU 1208.38, or Aristonicus Alexandrinus de Signis Iliadis, or Ptolemy's Tetrabiblos, or Moeris I can't even pronounce it, Atticista, Lexicon Atticum. These are extremely rare. In fact, we didn't know about some of these occurrences 50 years ago because they've been discovered, or they've been freshly transcribed, or they've been freshly translated. But you have to ask yourself the question, why would Paul use such a rare word in this situation? Now, let's say for argument's sake, and I think it's wrong, but let's say for argument's sake, the verb means to have authority in a neutral or positive way. So the leader of a church. Many scholars argue that Paul's using authenteo to mean have neutral authority, or in a church context, positive authority, right? Now, the question I would raise with them is, why would Paul use this uncommon, extraordinarily uncommon verb when he had, according to Linda Belleville, possibly 50 or 60 other more common words? Perhaps the most likely candidate, if he wanted to say have authority, he would use exousiazo, where we get the noun exousia, which is Paul's normal way of talking about authority. He would use exousiazo, I think. There are other words he could use, but note this. Exousiazo occurs 900 times in the existing ancient Greek literature that we have access to. 900 times. On the highest end of the occurrences of authenteo, 12 times. Okay? So 905 versus 12. Why? Why, if he's the apostle that wants to teach clearly to all the churches, why does he use a word that is so rare? Now, when I teach my students, here's how I say it. Imagine you use a word. that you've never heard before, that you've never seen written before, that you'll never speak again and you'll never read again in print. That's how rare this word is. And yet, there are scholars that say, okay, this is essentially equivalent to exousiazo. And my question would be, why doesn't he use that other word? And I think it's because an unusual circumstance, yes, it was 905 is exousiazo, maybe 12 for authenteo. Why would he use such, so I think an unusual circumstance requires an unusual word to give a very specific meaning. And if you look at the King James, for example, the King James translates it, I think, domineer or usurp authority. And if you go back to the Old Latin, so if we don't have a whole lot of Greek uses to look at to compare, and even the ones we have, I've looked at them, and it's really hard to argue out exactly what they mean. Now, I'll give you some tips on who to read, but Cynthia Westphal has done her homework on this. She's done some great work on this. I'll quote from her in a minute. But one way to know what Greek words mean in the New Testament, other than looking at other uses of it, is to look at how they're translated in other languages when the Bible was translated into Latin and Syriac and Coptic and Georgian and Armenian and all this other stuff. So, if we look at the Old Latin, so these are Latin manuscripts that predate the Vulgate. They use a Latin word that means dominate. If we look at the Vulgate also uses the language of dominate. And Linda Belleville has done a ton of work on the reception history of how translations throughout history have translated authenteo into English and into other languages like Spanish and other languages. And by and large, until the 20th century, they translated some form of domineer. Now, Cynthia Westphal, I will give you access to where to find her article, because she's written a really, I would say, really detailed linguistic analysis of this. Probably, if you're not seminary trained, it'll be really difficult to read. I probably would say you would need help if you're going to understand what she's saying. But I'm going to read from this, and you tell me if you understand it. But she said, I agree with her conclusion, even though I don't know as much about linguistics as she does. She says, when authenteo occurs with a personal actor and a personal goal, a negative valuation is given unless the actor has divine or ultimate authority. This appears to be because it has a destructive force when applied to an animate goal, and it is an inappropriate action for those who do not have the authority over life and death. So here's what she's saying. She's saying it is an action of an actor that is trying to take the powers of life and death in their hands over someone or something. And so it has a tendency towards destroying or abusing the other. So here's what she says. She as a kind of translation. Forcing a person against their will in a destructive way. Forcing a person against their will in a destructive way, and you might even translate it, gloss it as overpowering so as to harm. And I'm quoting from her again. She says, no person should take this kind of action against another person within church context. This is what Paul's saying. Because no one should have the power to harm or force another person in the church. And exercising that sort of power would be abusive by virtually any standards. Now, you're going to have to read her whole argument, but she looks at all the evidence, and she looks at every scrap of evidence. And I find her argument compelling when you look at the whole picture of what I've said about the Old Latin and some of the ways it's been translated throughout history, but I think she's essentially right. Now, you might say, my commentary says, but let me just tell you, I'm working on my 7th commentary, okay? And what I've noticed is commentaries take a lot of work, a lot of time. You don't look all the primary material up. You end up having to rely on already existing scholarship. You just can't look up every primary source, every BGU 120838. You're not going to look that up if you're writing a commentary unless you're going to take 30 years to do it. So you end up relying on certain studies. Now, many commentators today are relying on outdated studies that don't know about some of the newer stuff that has been freshly transcribed. And so, for example, I was reading Mounce. Mounce's Pastoral Epistles commentary, Biblical commentary, and Mounce is known to be a really competent Greek scholar, and he wrote a textbook, right? And I was shocked. And go read it for yourself if you think I'm, not being fair. He doesn't engage with any of those primary sources. He relies on two scholars, Baldwin and Wilshire, who have done studies of this, and they have been heavily criticized by scholars in more recent years for not being comprehensive in looking at the material and looking at it and here's one of the biggest issues, looking at it in a relevant period of history. So if you're studying what authenteo means in 1st century CE, AD, you're not going to look at 4th century CE material or 5th century, because words can change over time and the word uses can change. So you want to look as close to that time as possible. And one of the criticisms against Baldwin and Wilshire are that they're not looking at a narrow enough scope of information to fit into the time period that would make the most sense for interpreting Paul's use of authenteo. I'm going to give you some more information on this, but I would recommend, if you want to read kind of the other side, who's doing the best work on the view that it means have authority, I'll give you some information later on after this lecture by Al Walters. Al Walters has done probably the most detailed work in recent years on this. And Linda Belleville, Cynthia Westphal, and Yamin Hubner all are in dialogue with Walters and others on what this word means. Okay, so having said that, I want to take a cue from Nicholas Waltersdorf, who's a theologian, and he once said, and I read this many, many years ago, but he once said, if this text proves to be an obscure text, it doesn't bear clear teaching on this. And I would say even the most committed complementarians would agree that we really don't know exactly what this word means. In fact, I had to press on Denny Burke, who's on Twitter, I had to press him and say, you can't keep appealing to this text. And you can't criticize people like N.T. Wright for questioning this text unless you can tell me why you think authenteo means have authority. And he's like, oh, I rely on Al Walters. And I said, that's not enough. You need to read Westphal. You need to read Belleville. You need to read Hubner and really dig in to the responses to that. So Walterdorf says, when you have such an ambiguous text, we cannot in good conscience treat this as a foundation text for issues of church, gender, and authority. That's not a quote. I'm summarizing him. So I think, bottom line, 1 Timothy is less about basic instructions for church leaders and more for how to clamp down on church-splitting false teaching. It's less about basic instructions for church leaders and more about how to clamp down on church-splitting false doctrine or false teaching. So how would I translate it? I think usurp authority is a translation that has existed in the past that makes sense. Dominate or domineer over also makes sense. Wrestle control from or something like that could go in that direction. Okay, point number 3. Let's say for argument's sake Paul was saying I don't allow women to have authority over a man in a kind of a neutral way. The problem is Paul just doesn't talk like that. He doesn't say things like that in terms of his attitude towards women. Yes, in 1 Corinthians he says women should be silent, but he knows that women pray and prophesy in the church. He says men have authority over the woman's body, but woman has authority over her husband's body, and so forth. Have authority is not really how Paul normally expresses the work of leaders. I looked at Paul's letters, and his more natural expressions are things like diakonia, exercising servant leadership, as he does with Stephanus in 1 Corinthians 16. Or 1 Thessalonians 5, where he uses proistemi, about acknowledging those people who, and the NIV translates proistemi as care for you, care over you, care for you. We also know that men weren't the only leaders in the church. There are apparently some house churches that had female figureheads, women like Nympha and Chloe. They would have been kind of people of honor, hosts, and perhaps even vocal leaders in their communities. And this is really interesting and often not brought into discussion. Even in 1 Timothy, Paul knows that women are capable of managing well because he actually commands widows to get married and be oikadaspoteo, good rulers, good rulers over their household. But this is where we get the word despot from. So you might say good rulers over their household, lords, matrons over their household. And the concept is managers over their household, like a business manager. And so Paul does not seem to have any specific concerns. Well, interesting. I was reading Theodore Mopsuestia, who's a early patristic writer and a bishop, and he thinks that Paul is saying women should submit, but in this particular text, he's actually quick to say, I don't know why, but he's quick to say, but that doesn't mean women shouldn't teach. And he goes on to say, this is more saying they shouldn't be, boisterous and problematic. And it's interesting. He seems embarrassed by any sense that this would kind of forbid women from teaching in the church. And I might get a chance a little bit later to talk about Jerome, because there's some interesting things about Jerome as well. So number 3, have authority is not really how Paul normally expresses the work of leaders. And it's dangerous if we turn that into what Paul is all about, because then it's about power, and I don't think that's what he's all about. Number 4, the concept of teaching. Okay, so I'm talking about the concept of teaching. This seems, now this is my reading, but this seems specifically about teaching core doctrines, and not about what we call preaching. Okay, Paul says, I don't allow women to teach or to usurp authority from a man or domineer over a man, let's say. Now let me just say this. We often collapse teaching and preaching as kind of one thing. So if you job advertisement for a teaching pastor, we assume they're going to be preaching. But we need to be careful with how we talk about that, because we often talk about it anachronistically. Paul doesn't actually talk about didaskalia, teaching, very often in his letters. He talks about it a lot in 1 Timothy. But if you look at his letters, he doesn't actually talk about it that much. So when we say women can't be preachers, I'm going to return to this issue again later on, but Paul is not, he doesn't really ever talk about preaching the way that we do preaching today, and I'll talk about that later. But I think what he's talking about is teaching catechesis, core doctrines of the faith, the essentials of Christianity. That was what was being undermined in Ephesus. So Paul wanted to make sure that women weren't adding to the problem with their misinformation. Okay, number 5. In order to properly contextualize 1 Timothy, you have to recognize the problem of overbearing women may be specific to Ephesus. The problem of overbearing women may be specific to Ephesus. Now, I spent the last week or two digging as deep as I can into the culture and history of ancient Ephesus. And I feel like you can't fully understand the issues involving men and women in this text unless you understand Ephesus. Just as we know, cities around the U.S. have their own identity and culture. So the difference between L.A. versus Birmingham versus New York City versus Seattle versus Houston versus Indianapolis, they're each going to have their own culture. And just as with that, Ephesus has its own culture. And you have to reckon with the fact that Ephesus was basically a culture that glorified the empowerment of women. Now, that doesn't mean it wasn't a patriarchal culture. It surely was. But there is a female deity named Ephesian Artemis, or Artemis of the Ephesians, as we learn about in the book of Acts, who is the patron deity of Ephesus. Now, you may have heard of Artemis, also known as Diana, but you have to know that in a particular city, it's going to take on its own culture. And this particular city was passionately devoted to this deity, more than any other city except Rome, probably. I can't find another city that replicates this singular passion for a deity than Ephesus for Artemis. Now, you might say, Dr. Gupta, you're full of baloney. And what I would say is I spent the last week reading through Jerome Murphy O'Connor, famous New Testament historian, archaeologist, St. Paul's Ephesus, and he goes through every ancient text that he could find that mentions Ephesus. A sentence, a paragraph, a section, and he gives the actual source information from Appian, Strabo, Pausanias, Josephus, Pliny, Vitruvius. I mean, he gives just about everything. And Artemis appears almost on every page in some way, shape, or form. Now, why is that important? Coins in Ephesus had her symbols on them. She was perpetually a virgin. She was unmarried. She was notably aggressive. She was an aggressive deity. One might even say, has outbursts. And she was known as kind of violent. So women in that city, and the city itself, took on that kind of persona. So, for example, her temple, which was famous, it was one of the biggest temples in the world. Her temple, they actually designed it to look womanly. The columns were more slender, and they had kind of rings that looked like hair and things like that. This idea that women were wearing jewelry and things in the church could be kind of similar because Artemis was known to kind of be dressed in jewelry, her statue in the temple. I think that the heresy in Ephesus that Timothy was dealing with had some connection to that kind of character of the city. And Paul was basically correcting that and saying, no, we can't act in these ways of subversion and antagonism, women towards men. And in 1 Corinthians we see Paul saying a similar thing, but saying, men can't be antagonistic toward women, women towards men, and so forth. There are some interesting clues, I think, in 1 Timothy that Artemis is in the background or in the context. Multiple times, Paul refers to salvation, sozo, soteria, soter, and Artemis, according to at least one ancient writer, possibly more, Artemis's name means safe. And she was the patron goddess, this is really interesting, she was the patron goddess, of childbirth. Paul's saying you'll be saved through childbirth. And there are some scholars, and I think this is true, having just studied the issue freshly, although it's hard to say, that Ephesian women normally prayed to Artemis to protect them and not curse them during childbirth. And one of the reasons for that is because when Artemis was born nearby to Ephesus in Ortygia, she has a twin brother, Apollo, right? She was born first, and because she's a deity, she kind of immediately grew to full size and had kind of an adult level of competence. And then she helped her mother give birth to her brother. That's a famous story. If we could sit down and talk, I could give you all the dirty details. But I think this actually has to do with not only the idea of being saved through childbirth, saying, no, Christ will protect you. But number two, I think it also has to do with why Adam and Eve are mentioned. Because Ephesus, and if you read this, and Murphy O'Connor is Catholic, he has no bone to pick with complementarians, egalitarianism. He doesn't really care as far as I understand. If you read this, it's very clear that Ephesians were proud, especially Ephesian women, I'm assuming, were proud of a history where they come first, where they were born first. So Artemis was born first. And I think that may have been an argument, at least implicitly used by women, of wrestling control and domineering over men. Artemis was born first, like I'm in Portland and we play against Seattle in soccer, and we love to say we got the MLS Cup first. And, we like to brag about that priority, right? And I think this may be the reason Paul says Adam was born. Adam came first, right? Then Eve. And Eve was deceived first. And I don't think he's saying this as a whole universal thing. I think his appeal to creation texts are important. But in this circumstance, he says Adam wasn't deceived, but Adam was deceived, right? And actually, patristic writers are quick to say that. Obviously, we know Adam was deceived. Read Romans 5. But I think he's saying, listen, women, you aren't superior. So I think the takeaway from that is Paul was actually concerned with overbearing women, not women in general, and certainly not women everywhere in all times. All right, I'm going to give some quick takeaways, then we'll do Q&A. So, Paul ultimately in this church, 1 Timothy, in the church in Ephesus, he wants unity. He's concerned about false teaching is creating superiority, it's creating divisions. Secondly, he's saying women should not domineer over men. Multiple writers, read this book. If you read it cover to cover, then I will have a private conversation with you about what you discover. Multiple ancient writers refer to the foundation of the city of Ephesus, by fierce Amazon women. And even some writers are like, this is crazy. When has women ever won anything? And yet they talk about how the Amazons were fierce and powerful women. So even the state itself has a foundation, even before the cult of Artemis, of female power. And we see that perhaps coming out in this. Okay, I want to get back to the preaching and teaching question. We'll open up Q&A. Preaching in the New Testament, in my view, preaching in the New Testament, when it refers to preaching, it's primarily referring to evangelistic proclamation, not Sunday sermon. So what about modern preaching, which we might call inspirational preaching, right? In my understanding, the early church doesn't really talk about this. It probably happened informally, but they don't have a specific name for it. Teaching, on the other hand, is related to core doctrine. So does 1 Timothy 2 bar women from teaching catechesis? I want to say in this text, 1 Timothy, Paul is concerned with motive, right? Why are they doing it? Are they doing it to teach a lesson to those men? And education. It's quite well known that false teachers were preying upon the women because they were more easily persuaded. Not because they're dumb, and Paul never says they're dumb. Paul is probably concerned with the fact they just don't know enough of kind of the teachings of Christianity to rebuke the false teachers. Paul repeats in this text a concern over chatter, women chattering, which is kind of like the barbershop or salon gossip. So that shows that Paul's not really concerned with a lack of intelligence, which pagan leaders thought that women were stupid. Paul never says that. What would Paul think today about women leaders in the church? I think honestly, he was an ancient. Ancients were not modern egalitarians. He would want to test each leader, male and female. And I think if he saw the gifting, and if he saw the wisdom, and if he saw the empowered leadership, I think that he would be all about accepting them. Does this text bar women from preaching? Let me say this because I think it's defensible. Paul has nothing to say about inspirational preaching. He talks more about evangelism, and he talks a little bit about catechism or doctrine. He doesn't really say anything about what we call inspirational preaching. Now we do have, concerns that the church was committing itself to the teaching of the apostles, but we might say that's scriptural public reading of scripture. We know that Paul accepted women prophesied in the church in 1 Corinthians. So Paul treats the authoritative, biblically or spiritually authoritative voice of the woman as normal. We also know that he trusted women at the highest level of his work, such as Phoebe taking the letter to the Romans and serving as his proxy. I just finished an article on Phoebe that I'm trying to get published, and I argue that it means something special that Paul sent this one woman as his proxy in Rome, and she basically is invested with his voice and authority, and that's a powerful thing. We have women like Euodia and Syntyche in Philippians 4, who are what we might think of as top-level leaders. They probably had voice, although we don't really know exactly what they did, but almost certainly they were deacons, but perhaps also one or both were overseers. Okay, we're wrapping up here. I want to caution you against lexicons. Excuse me, lectionaries are great. I want to caution you about lexicons. You may know if you went to seminary about BDAG or LSJ or the new BRILDAG. These are all cool biblical terms that we use in seminary. But I'll tell you what, BDAG took out the meaning domineer of their entry on Authenteo based on the work of Baldwin and Wilshire from the late 20th century. And I think that was a mistake, and Linda Belleville has argued forcefully that that was a mistake. And not for that reason, but in general, I don't like BDAG. I find BDAG overly imposing theological categories on things, missing things regularly. I use Lunida, if you know about lexicons. I use Lunida. I use Moulton and Milligan, although it is outdated, it's still really good. LSJ has its problems because it's covering too long of a period of time. So lexicons, just know they're helpful, but they're not objective. Okay, we often think reference resources are objective. They're not. They are tools to use, but also question. And I question BDAG all the time. So I tend to use Lunida. I think Lunida is way better. I think it's more sticking to the information rather than making sort of theological decisions, although you can't get away from that. Okay. Priscilla is often discounted as a leader in the church because she led in a private atmosphere. But, man, this is where you just have to understand how the Roman world worked. Homes were places where you lived and were places of business. Okay? Lydia probably operated out of her home. Most women, men, operated their businesses either out of their home or in conjunction with their home. I can give you a lot more information on that later. But this idea that, oh, Priscilla was at home, and therefore the home is different than the church. Where do you think churches met? They met in homes. So we make the home-work distinction today. They did not make that back then at all. Like, at all. So maybe they went to the market to do business, but the home wasn't viewed as a private sphere only. And I can, there's plenty of attestation of that, but Richard Sauer would be a good place to follow up on that. Okay. I'm going to take questions in a minute, but I want to make sure that I have a chance to do the giveaway. So I'm putting in here a form into the Facebook comments where you can go to a survey, and you can fill it out now, you can fill it out later, but I'm going to finish the giveaway by, let's say, 10 minutes after 2. So fill that out, and that way I can kind of objectively take the full number of people and then do the giveaway. So I'll be emailing you whether you won or not. And there's an opportunity to get a special discount code from InterVarsity. You don't have to fill it out, and they promised me they're not going to junk mail you. But I will, to people that sign up on there, I will send out a list of reading resources on this subject if you're interested. So fill out that form. You don't have to do it now, but why don't we go ahead and put in questions into the comments and maybe vote on a few of them, and I'll engage with those right now. I'll give you a minute to put some questions in while I organize my notes here. While you're doing that, I'm just going to say something real quick. I read a nice book by J. Twomey, who kind of studies the reception history of the Pastoral Epistles, and he makes the link is not working, huh? All right. Let me see if I can fix that. Is the link not working for everybody? It's working for me is the problem. All right. Someone said it worked for them, so give it your best. Give it your best go. Sorry. Okay. I will say, why don't you put some questions in? Okay. Work for a couple people, so do the best you can. Any questions? Otherwise, I have a couple more things. Okay, while you're writing questions, I'll say a couple things. So, I want to give the example of Jerome. Jerome's really interesting. He's an early Christian writer, known as kind of the translator of the Vulgate. And Twomey says that Jerome had strong hierarchical impulses, meaning he believed that men were essentially superior in the church to women in terms of teaching authority, leadership, etc., etc. But Jerome had a student of his, a woman student named Marcella, and he recognized that she was brilliant. She was really, really smart. She was sharp as a tack. She understood the scriptures. She understood kind of the more academic discussion of the scriptures. And he had this need to defend her as someone who was becoming kind of a person of importance in his sphere. People would notice how smart she was, how sharp she was. And he was careful not to be outspoken in defense of her because he didn't want to give people the wrong idea about the church. He didn't want to embroil the church in scandal. But he says men would come to learn from her, including priests, and ask her exegetical questions. Her name is Marcella. And he says this, she would give, quote, her own opinion not as her own, but as from me, Jerome, or from another leader, male leader, thus admitting that she was taught what she was taught. She had been taught herself from others. For she knew that the apostle had said, I suffer not a woman to teach, and she would not seem to inflict a wrong upon the male sex. So the reason why Twomey brings this up is to say Jerome found himself in a bind where he couldn't support a women teacher, and yet he recognized she was amazing. And so he basically said she can teach because what she's taught has been taught to her by men. And that is a very common sentiment we see in pockets throughout history where women on paper are not allowed to teach or have authority, but there are these women that are gifted and they are kind of moving through the cracks and loopholes of these rules. And men are recognizing it, and they're recognizing by the Spirit that we can't just do nothing about that. We have to let them exercise their gifts because they are just that incredible. And actually, Twomey gives the example of Luther. He says, Luther wrote, if it happened that no one could be secured for a teaching office, then a woman might step up and preach to others as best she could, but in no other instance. So Luther did not allow a woman to kind of just kind of objectively hold the authority of a teaching leader, but he's saying, you know, of course they're capable, they could be capable of it. So you find these kind of binds that throughout history they get themselves into where they have on paper, you know, against women teachers, and yet they recognize these women that are highly gifted in learning, studying, and teaching. Okay, so one question is, where do you start when you're starting to talk to people about this text? So, you know, it depends on who they are, but I would say translations are really important, and we trust the clarity of Scripture. We believe in the doctrine of the perspicuity of Scripture, which means all Scripture is clear. And yet, hang on. And yet, there are texts where we just don't know everything we wish we knew. And so, for example, oh boy, this is my son trying to play video games with his friends, and it keeps coming up on my computer for some reason. We don't know everything we want to know, but with translations like this, look at a variety of translations. You're going to see a variety of different information, and it is really important that we recognize that this is one of those texts that's just not clear. So I would show them King James. I would show them Common English Bible. I would show them a variety of texts that are going to challenge the view of their own favorite translation, perhaps the ESV or the Holman Christian Standard Bible. I would go back to the ancient world and say, you know, we have the Vulgate text from the early church. We have the Old Latin. And some of the commentaries you read are going to explain some of these things, but it is really crucial that we start to look at the bigger picture other than just what my Bible says. Someone asked about the Adam and Eve part. I've already talked about that a little bit, but I would say I used to believe that just an appeal to Adam and Eve is going to be a kind of universal for all kind of thing. But if you dig into the details of this particular argument, Paul says some tricky things in there. And he says, for example, Adam wasn't deceived. Adam was deceived. So you have to try to get a sense for not just that he's making a creational argument, but exactly what the creational argument is. And this reminds me of something, so I'm thankful that you said that. There's a book by Alan Paget called As Christ Submits to the Church. And he says in that book that the argument for complementarianism or hierarchalism or patriarchalism, whatever you want to call it, he says it's changed over time. The argument prior to about the 1970s, the women's right movement, 60s, 70s, 80s, prior to that, the argument against women teachers, women leaders in the church, equal in marriage and church, is that women are less competent intellectually, emotionally, management, leadership-wise. So even if you go back to scholars like Thomas Schreiner, Douglas Moo, in their earliest writings on this, they kind of tip their hat at these kinds of things. That there are certain reasons why women are a certain way, and God's made them that way, and that's okay, but they can't do these things. We start to see a shift. Paget says we see a shift in the 70s and 80s in particular, where we see women CEOs, women professors, women senators, right? We're starting to see women in leadership. We're starting to see they're competent. They're as competent as men. Some of them excel over men in math and science and all kinds of things. And we start to see that, okay, we can't sustain the argument that women are gullible or easily tricked, or things like that. We just can't sustain that. Just culturally, we can't actually look at women and say they're not as competent to make intellectual-based decisions as men. And so Paget says we see a shift there to the gender roles language. So then it's not so much about pure capability as much as God designed you for the home and you for the church or workspace. So you have someone like Thomas Schreiner who says, Paul did not imagine a woman in the elder meeting. And I would say that's a very modernistic way of looking at relationships and looking at ancient relationships. So, for example, think about Abraham and Sarah going all the way back to the Old Testament and how actually close they were in conversation. If you read Romans 16, look at how many women leaders Paul knows by name. Paul knows by name more women leaders, I think, than a lot of modern pastors do. And male pastors know by name. It's shocking how many women he seemed to have constantly surrounded himself with. And to say then, we're going to shut the door on the leader, on the elder meeting, I think that's anachronistic. I'm going to really quickly say, someone asked more about the home, private, public thing. So we're going to end here in a minute, but the thing I want to say is a very, very, very common practice in the ancient world was something called the patronage system, where you are either a leader that latches them, where a kind of someone in need latches themselves to, or vice versa. And what you do is your clients, these people that need your help, they would come to your house. And they would stand outside or come into like a foyer and they would say, Nija, you're so good looking and you're so important and this and that. And then I'd say, here's some money, here's some food. And so the house was seen as a space that kind of transcended just the private sphere. You would have bedroom, people don't go in a bedroom, but you have all these other spaces that are very public. Public even for strangers or people just kind of knocking on the door or people that need hospitality. So the assumption that Priscilla or even anyone else was reserved to the home, that misunderstands the nature of home, the nature of houses. And maybe in the bibliography I send out, I'll put some resources in there as well. There are a number of really great resources to actually. I'll just do one though, and so this one I just finished reading, and I don't often buy books. I either get them on EBSCO or Interlibrary Loan or but this one I actually bought, and it's called A Woman's Place: House Churches and Earliest Christianity by Carolyn Osiak and Margaret MacDonald with Janet Tulloch. It's fantastic. I read it cover to cover, and I learned so much, and I wish every New Testament scholar could read this book because these scholars really, 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 really know their stuff about the ancient world and about ancient households, and it's going to answer a lot of those questions about women in the ancient household. All right, our time is up. Some of you have asked how this is going to be available later on. It's going to take me a little while to get it back on up, but I'm hoping by next week I'll have it for review. So I will definitely have it available on my blog next week. But until then, you might have to wait a bit until I figure out, until I get it transported over there. All right, that's the end for this time. I'm glad to see many of you here and interested. If you have ideas for future lectures, I'm considering doing another one next month. Please, by all means, send me a message and let me know what you think. If you want to give feedback on this lecture, I encourage that, because I am writing a chapter on this for a book I'm working on called Women Leaders of the Earliest Christian Churches. And if you filled out that form, if you just popped in, there's a form I put in there. Fill out that form. I'll be choosing 2 or 3 leaders to receive 2 or 3 viewers to receive a free book from our gracious sponsors, University Press Academic, and also possibly a promo code for a discount. So blessings, be well, and I just want to encourage you, if you're interested in seminary, go ahead and check out Northern Seminary, where I teach now. I'm teaching a course right now in Philippians. And join us. I don't know if I mentioned this in the last lecture, but in the winter 2021, I'm going to teach a course on women in the New Testament. So if you want a whole course of this, from beginning to end for a whole quarter, that's what I plan on doing for the winter. So then you can engage, ask questions, be more in dialogue. Okay. Blessings, all of you.